To Cuba now on Monocle 24, where the draft of a new constitution will be presented to the National Assembly next week. In it, profound changes to the way the government officially recognises private property. The idea has long been a troubled one in the communist-run country. Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Dr. Helen Yaffe, who's an lecturer in economic and social history at the University of Glasgow. Welcome back to Monocle 24, Helen. Explain to us the general gist of this new constitution.
Well, Cuba has been going under a process of economic reforms really since 2011, although some of them started earlier when Raúl took over the presidency. And what has happened is it's created new forms of property ownership and also an increase in foreign investment. And that hasn't been reflected yet in the constitution, which hasn't been changed for some time. So for those of us who have been watching developments in Cuba very closely, this has not come as a surprise, and there's nothing here startling. Although we haven't actually seen the draft, what we've seen is a summary of the draft, which appeared in the daily newspaper of the Cuban Communist Party. So we knew that, Raúl had stood up and said, well, we have allowed people to become self-employed. We've also allowed them to contract other workers, and what's happened is a sort of spontaneous development of small and medium-sized businesses, and that's not reflected in the constitution. We don't yet have a legal framework to deal with that. So this is an attempt to really make the constitution catch up with the reality on the ground and some of the decrees and regulations that have been passed in recent years.
So in that context, you say we have a little bit of a clue of what's going on, but the headlines that seem to be coming out are of great ambitious changes to the way that private property is managed. Tell us a little bit more about that, because it isn't quite as clear-cut as some are suggesting.
No. I mean, there is, whenever anything happens in Cuba, there's a sort of knee-jerk sensationalist reaction from those who really would like to see Cuba transition towards a capitalist system. But the draft is going to make very clear that Cuba will remain a socialist economy dominated by state ownership of the fundamental means of production, as they say, and by central planning. What's really happening here, if we want to understand the drive behind this and whether this is a political intention to move towards a market, or whether this is measure of expediency. I mean, Cuba is essentially economically isolated. They went through this catastrophic economic collapse following the collapse of the Soviet bloc, and GDP fell there by 35%, and they entered a period known as the special period of the 1990s. Now, commentators debate whether when this finished, whether it finished, and to what extent. But the fact is that Cuba needs capital for investment in its old infrastructure, in some of its modern technology, to be able to reinsert itself in the world economy, and to do it in the context where it has a very punishing United States blockade, which will not allow it to even, transact in dollars in the international economy. And that's the challenge that Cuba faces. So where does it get this capital that it needs? It has to get it from abroad. And whether it gets it from remittances sent from mainly from the United States by family members to Cubans in Cuba, who then set up their small cafes or their places for people to stay and so on, casa particulares, or whether it gets it from foreign investment. It's all about the need for this foreign capital to be able to develop the country in very, very difficult circumstances.
The circumstances, however, look like a long-term shift away from the mindset of the Castros. Miguel Díaz-Canel, what is he actually long-term intending to do with this constitution?
Well, just to put it in context, I mean, we talk about the shift from the Castros. Let's remember that Raúl Castro remains the general secretary of the Cuban Communist Party and will remain there probably for another year and a half. So it's not like he's just, hung up his boots and off he's gone. Miguel Díaz-Canel was carefully selected, carefully nurtured. He has been well prepared. He's not going to shock anyone. He's the power structure in Cuba is quite lots of checks and balances. It's not like he has ultimate power or decision making. And there are some interesting things that will appear in the new constitution as well in terms of balance of power. So there'll be 3 key political figures in Cuba. We'll have, as we said, the General Secretary of the Cuban Communist Party. There will also be a President of the Republic, which is a newly created position. Now, we always refer to Fidel Castro, Raul Castro as the president, but actually they were the president of something called the Council of State, which is selected through the National Assembly, the equivalent of our parliament. That role will now be called Prime Minister. And I'm saying all this without any certainty because this is just the summary that's been provided for us, which lacks clarity. So there'll be 3 figures who will have a prime minister, a president, and the general secretary of the Communist Party. So lots of checks and balances, and I suspect no big surprises.
Helen Yaffe, many thanks for joining us on Monocle 24.